8,000 warriors stand in formation beneath the earth of China, and for decades we thought we understood what they were. We were wrong. AI ran its analysis, and what it found hiding in plain sight, something so specific, so personal, so biometric, rewrites the entire story of who these soldiers really were. Stay with us, because the detail that changes everything is not what anyone expected. In 1974, farmers digging a well outside Xi'an cracked open the ground and accidentally changed history forever. What they found was an army, thousands of life-sized clay warriors buried in precise military formation beneath the soil for over 2,000 years. For decades, scholars called it symbolic, ritual art, a statement of imperial power meant to serve the emperor in the afterlife. That interpretation felt solid. It felt complete. But then AI and high-resolution 3D imaging entered the picture, and that comfortable explanation began to collapse. Because the deeper researchers looked, the more the evidence pointed toward something far more unsettling than symbolism. What if these warriors were never meant to be symbolic at all? Here is the claim that started to unravel everything. Not one single warrior in the Terracotta army shares the same ear shape. Not one. Out of thousands of clay figures, across an entire buried battalion, researchers found 0 identical ear geometries. 0. That finding did not come from a casual observation. It came from a rigorous 2014 study using 3-dimensional scanning technology applied directly to the warriors themselves. Researchers used computer vision systems to map the fine structural details of each figure's ears, the curves, the ridges, the precise topology of the outer ear, what anatomists call the auricle. And what the data returned was extraordinary. Every single warrior presented a biometrically distinct ear shape. The variation was not random noise. It was systematic, consistent. The kind of variation you find not in manufactured templates, but in actual human beings. Susan Green co-authored the classification study published through Science Direct, and the methodology was precise. The team developed a system for categorizing ear morphology across the figures, building a framework rigorous enough to distinguish individual warriors from one another based on that single feature alone. Think about what that means for a moment. Forensic scientists use ear shape as a biometric identifier in criminal investigations because human ears are that distinctive. No 2 people on Earth share the exact same ear geometry. And here, in an army of clay soldiers crafted over 2,000 years ago, that same principle appears to be encoded into the sculpture itself. Now, the standard explanation for the Terracotta Army's craftsmanship has always leaned on the workshop model. Historians and archaeologists have long argued that the figures were produced in sections, heads, torsos, arms, legs, assembled from a range of pre-formed templates and then individually detailed by artisans. That model is not wrong, exactly. The evidence for workshop production is real, but the ear study exposed a crack in that explanation that nobody had fully confronted before. Workshop templates, even highly varied ones, cannot account for this level of individual biometric distinction. Templates repeat. Human faces repeat. Ears, if you are working from a mold or a standardized form, repeat. These did not. The implication that researchers began to circle around was significant. If the ear shapes are this individually distinct in the same way actual human ears are distinct, then the sculptors were not working from imagination or from template libraries alone. They were working from life, meaning real soldiers, real men, may have stood as the physical models for these clay figures. Their faces, their features, their ears, recorded in clay and sealed underground for millennia. And ears were not the only variable. The 3D imaging revealed similar levels of individual variation across facial structures more broadly: jawlines, cheekbone placement, the geometry of brows and noses. The more the scanning data accumulated, the harder it became to explain the figures as purely artistic constructions. Something more deliberate, more human, more personal was embedded in the making of this army. But here is where the story deepens into something genuinely unsettling. If real soldiers served as models, if real human identities were captured in these clay faces, then the Terracotta Army is not just a monument to imperial power. It is something closer to a record, a gallery, an archive of actual human beings who lived, who served, who were perhaps conscripted into the Emperor's afterlife project without ever fully understanding what they were part of. And the vast majority of that archive has never been opened. Estimates suggest that fewer than a quarter of the known burial pits have been excavated. The rest remain sealed, untouched, still holding whatever and whoever was preserved inside them. So if the ears tell us these faces were real, the question that follows is inevitable. Whose faces are they? Here is what a peer-reviewed study published in NPJ Heritage Science concluded, and it is worth letting this land slowly. The facial measurements of the terracotta warriors are not idealized. They are not artistic conventions. They are not the product of a sculptor imagining what a soldier should look like. Statistically, they match the biometric profiles of real Chinese populations from that era. Real faces, real people, translated into clay. That is the specific claim, and the evidence behind it is harder to dismiss than you might expect. Researchers used advanced geometric morphometric analysis, the same category of technique used in modern forensic facial reconstruction, to map the three-dimensional structure of the warriors' faces. What they found was that the variation across the figures follows the same distribution you would expect from an actual human population. Not a random scatter, not an artistic range. A statistically coherent spread that mirrors how real faces differ from person to person within a group. The warriors don't just look different from each other. They look different from each other in exactly the way real people do. Then there is the second layer of evidence: contemporary biometric profiles. When researchers compared the facial geometry of the warriors against documented measurements of Chinese populations, both historical and modern, the match was significant. These faces weren't pulled from imagination. They cluster within the ranges of real human facial structure in ways that idealized art simply does not. Classical Greek sculpture, for instance, follows entirely different geometric logic. Faces built toward an ideal, not toward a person. The terracotta warriors trend the opposite direction, toward specificity, toward individuality, toward someone. And then the paper uses a phrase that stops you cold. The researchers describe the warriors as, quote, real soldier substitutes. Not artistic representations, not symbolic stand-ins. Substitutes. The language implies a direct correspondence, that each figure was meant to replace a specific living individual in the Emperor's afterlife army. Not to evoke soldiers in general, but to stand in for soldiers in particular. Think about what that means at scale. There are an estimated 8,000 warriors in the burial complex. 8,000. If the faces are real, if the biometric data holds, if the paper's conclusion is correct, then the tomb does not contain 8,000 statues. It contains 8,000 identities, 8,000 men who existed, who had names, ranks, families, histories, who stood in a workshop somewhere while sculptors studied their faces and pressed those faces into clay. And then those clay versions of them were buried underground, while the real men presumably went on living. Or didn't. We don't know what happened to the soldiers whose faces became the army. That record, if it ever existed, has not survived. But the implication sits there, quiet and enormous. Somewhere in those pits, in those long rows of warriors facing east, are the faces of people who once breathed, who once feared, who once stood at attention for an emperor who believed he would need them again after death. 8,000 portraits, 8,000 names we will never know. And that is only what we can see from the faces alone, because there is something else encoded in these figures, something that survived the burial, survived the centuries, survived the excavation, but barely. And when researchers finally understood what they were looking at, they realized the army they had been studying for decades looked almost nothing like the army that was actually buried. In 2022, a study published in the same journal, NPJ Heritage Science, confirmed something that archaeologists had suspected for years, but never fully documented at this scale. The terracotta warriors were not the color you see today. They were not bare clay. They were not gray. They were painted. Vividly, specifically, individually painted. And the pigment evidence that survived tells a story that is almost impossible to reconcile with what you see when you look at photographs of the excavation. The study identified complex pigment and chemical residues across multiple figures. Reds, greens, blues, blacks, whites, applied in layered combinations that indicate deliberate, individual choices. Not a uniform paint scheme applied across the whole army. Individual choices. Different colors on different warriors, different patterns, different details. The army that was buried was not a monochrome formation of identical clay soldiers. It was a visually differentiated, chromatically alive assembly of figures that would have looked, by every account the evidence supports, startling, almost overwhelming, like standing in front of 8,000 painted people. Here is the detail that makes this more than an aesthetic footnote. The pigment used on the warriors included Chinese blue and Chinese purple, synthetic compounds that are chemically complex and extraordinarily difficult to produce. These weren't cheap pigments slapped on quickly. They were precision materials. The application required skill, time, and deliberate craft. Someone, many someones, spent enormous effort making these figures look exactly right. Not approximately right, exactly right. And then it was all lost. Not slowly, not gradually over centuries, within minutes of excavation. That is the part that is hardest to sit with. When the warriors are exposed to air after more than 2,000 years underground, the pigment begins to delaminate almost immediately. The lacquer layer beneath the paint, the binding coat that held color to clay, dries and curls and lifts within 15 minutes of exposure. Early excavations in the 1970s and 1980s happened before conservators fully understood this process. Warriors were uncovered, documented, and the color was gone before anyone could stop it. Decades of excavation, thousands of figures, the color that made them real, gone in the time it takes to drink a cup of tea. What survives now are traces, chemical signatures, microscopic fragments of pigment caught in crevices. Enough to reconstruct what was there, not enough to bring it back. The army you see in photographs, the gray, solemn, austere formation, is not the army that was buried. The army that was buried was vivid. It was bright. It was, in the most literal sense, visually alive. Faces painted with individual skin tones. Armor painted in colors that designated rank, or unit, or origin. The whole thing designed not just to be present in the afterlife, but to be seen, to be recognized. And there is one more layer still unresolved. Researchers have identified what appear to be symbolic markings and inscriptions on some of the figures, details that have not yet been fully decoded. The pigment study opened a door, and what lies behind it is still being mapped. Some of these markings may be unit designations, some may be names, some may be something no one has categorized yet. The color is gone, but the markings remain. And if those markings are what some researchers suspect, if they are identifiers, labels, designations linking specific figures to specific people, then the army is not just a portrait gallery. It is a record, an archive, a document written in clay and pigment by people who expected it to last forever. The man who ordered all of this built didn't do it for art. He didn't do it for history. He did it because he believed, with the full force of absolute power, that what came after death would require the same infrastructure as what came before it. Qin Shi Huang did not build his afterlife army out of sentiment. Let's be precise about who this man was and what he believed power was for. He unified 7 warring territories into a single empire through what historians describe, without softening the language, as gory, bloody war. Decades of systematic military campaign, hundreds of thousands dead, entire noble houses erased. He didn't negotiate his empire into existence. He forced it. And when it was done, he didn't govern through affection or consensus. He governed through the credible threat of overwhelming force. His own recorded philosophy, preserved in the writings of his advisors and his own court, included a principle that translates roughly to this: only when feared can you be loved. Not feared or loved. Feared and therefore loved. Fear as the precondition for everything else. That philosophy did not stop at death. The Terracotta army was not built to comfort the emperor in the afterlife. That framing, the idea of a lonely ruler wanting company, misses the point entirely. The army was a projection of power into a domain where power had never been projected before. He was not preparing for rest. He was preparing for continuation. The same empire, the same authority, the same enforcement structure, just relocated underground. Think about the scale of what that required. The outer burial complex, the pits containing the warriors, covers an area of roughly 56 square kilometers. 56. That is not a grave. That is a military installation. The warriors are arranged in battle formation. There are command structures encoded in their positioning. There are cavalry units, infantry units, archers in kneeling and standing positions, chariots with horses. This is not symbolic. This is operational. Someone designed this the way you design a deployable army, because that is exactly what it was meant to be. And that is only the outer pits, the parts that have been excavated, the parts we have actually seen. The central tomb, the burial mound at the heart of the complex, the chamber where the emperor himself is interred, remains sealed. Not abandoned, not forgotten, sealed, under active state control. The Chinese government has made a deliberate decision not to excavate it, citing preservation concerns and the limits of current technology to protect what might be inside. That caution is real and scientifically defensible. But it also means that the inner chamber, the place where the man who built all of this actually lies, has not been opened in over 2,000 years. The ancient historian Sima Qian wrote about it. He described rivers of mercury flowing through the tomb to simulate the waterways of the empire. Crossbows rigged to fire automatically at intruders. A ceiling mapped with stars. A floor mapped with territory. A universe underground, built to the emperor's specifications. Subsequent surveys have detected elevated mercury levels in the soil above the burial mound. The crossbows are consistent with Qin-era engineering capability. The description is not myth. It is, in every testable detail, plausible. If the outer pits, the parts we can access, the parts we have studied, the parts where AI analysis found faces that match real people, if those outer pits contain this much truth, this much specificity, this much evidence of a man who meant every bit of it literally, then the question of what is inside the sealed inner tomb is not academic. It is the question this entire site is built around, and the answer is still locked underground. The sealed tomb beneath Mount Lee holds the most personal monument ever built, and it is still mostly underground. Subscribe now. The next hidden revelation drops soon.